Hearing is now resumed.
Mr. Commissioner, the examination of this panel will continue with Mark East going next.
Mark East for the Government of Canada, with my co-counsel, I was thinking of Governor Douglas, sorry, and my co-counsel Charles Fougere. I have been allocated 55 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this a bit shorter because I know we need to get back on time today, so I'm going to try to get my time done in 45 minutes if I can. Most of my questions, at least to start with, will be for Mr. Rosenberger. Mr. Rosenberger, at the end of the day yesterday, we were talking about, Ms. Fong was asking questions about the Heldsick fishery in 2010 and the fishery that took place in Johnston Strait, which is outside the Heldsick licensing area. And you were starting to provide an answer with respect to some of the management implications of harvesting outside of the fishing area. And Ms. Fong ran out of time and you weren't able to get to that answer. So I'd like to start with that, if I may. Before I do that, I just want to I'd like to look at a couple documents and put them to you if I could. First one is Exhibit 261. And this is DFO's policy for the management of Aboriginal fishing, dated August 6, 1993. You're familiar with this document?
I am.
And this is a public document. It's on, looks like this version's on from the DFO website.
That's correct.
If you go over to page 2, under B, policy subheading Aboriginal fishery, first bullet, I'm just going to take you to a couple quotes and I'm just going to ask you some questions. It says here, Aboriginal fishing should occur within the areas that were used historically by the Aboriginal group or First Nation. And then if we could go to page 7 of the document. Down under subheading 11, designation of individuals. Fourth bullet. I just want to read this into the record. Aboriginal individuals who wish to fish in an area outside their historical area must be designated by an Aboriginal fishing authority having a communal license to fish in the area in question. Such designation must be made under the agreement or license with the relevant fishing authority, and any fish harvested pursuant to the designation will be counted toward the allocation under its license. Are you familiar with those two provisions of the policy?
Yes, I am.
And then if we can go to Exhibit 1229, please. This is Canada's tab 13. And if you go over to page 2, under policy guidance, there's 3 bullets there. And I would just like to, well, maybe the second bullet, sub-bullet. First of all, let me talk about this document. Let me go back to the first page, sorry. Make sure you understand what this document is. So these are DFO's guidelines for responding to requests by Aboriginal organizations to fish for FSC purposes in areas not previously authorized under communal license issued by DFO. And it says at the top, internal DFO guidelines. Are you familiar with these guidelines?
Yes, I am.
So going back, sorry, to page 2. Maybe I'll just go to the 4th sub-bullet. Where an Aboriginal individual wishes to fish for FSC purposes in an area outside the community's historical area and in the historic area of another Aboriginal group, the individual may be designated by the other Aboriginal group to fish under the communal license for FSC purposes for the area in question. The other Aboriginal group must count the harvest against the allocation provided under the communal license issued to it. And continuing further in the next paragraph, with respect to the above points, see in particular fisheries agreements negotiated under the AFS, and the following paragraphs from the Policy of Management of Aboriginal Fishing, and we just went to those. So let me stop there. Would you agree that this is a long-standing DFO policy?
Yes, I would.
And why is it? Why is it that DFO has this policy? Why can't First Nations fish their FSC allocations under licenses wherever they wish?
Under the court cases, the First Nations have, and the Land Claim Treaty process, First Nations have asserted a right and titles to certain areas. So what we're striving for here is to make sure that we're following in that process. And from the department's side of things, in the, well, up until 1992, in some areas 1990, the department issued individual fishing licenses to any First Nation person from Canada to fish pretty much in any area. And that was, significant concerns were expressed by First Nations that claimed certain territories that the department was infringing upon their rights, limiting their fisheries, or causing other concerns. And so the department moved towards band licensing in some places in some places in the late 80s, but a few in 1990, and then all areas with the policy change from the Aboriginal Fishery Communal Licenses in 1992. So the department's trying to meet the objectives that the First Nations have laid out, and that the rights arise from a given area, not from, for example, all of Canada.
Thank you for that. And are there management implications with respect to, especially I guess for passing stocks, with respect to this policy? This is what we sometimes called the adjacency policy.
The management implications, as was started described yesterday, is that the goals and objectives are to try to understand the total run size, but then to allocate that out to various components. So conservation or the spawning objective being the highest priority, we take into account for the Fraser a management adjustment that takes into account the differences between our estimates or the estimates that are adopted by the panel and what we might see as far as catch and escapement upstream, and then allocate out to the First Nations and others. And we're doing that on the 4 stock groupings, as has been described in this process. And generally, there's one or more of those stocks as a limiting factor, or it might even be another species, coho or pink, in different times. And so when you are making those kinds of determinations and trying to best utilize all of the fish and making an allocation to escapement, to a management adjustment, or to a First Nation, or just some process, if there's other fish taken out in addition to that, and they're not accounted or understood in the process, then you could be creating conservation concerns or allocation issues for some other groups.
So to put this in a summary way, it's not just that DFO in managing the stocks needs to know how many fish are being taken, but needs to know where they're being taken and when in any given year.
That's correct.
Okay. And if we can go to the same document over the next page. And there's a list of different, maybe zero in on the list of 9 factors. And it says DFO will take the following factors into account when reviewing a request from an Aboriginal organization. And this is a request for a change in fishing area from what's in its license. And there's a number there, and I guess number 3 is the one we've just been talking about, potential impact on other Aboriginal groups or other users of the resource. Is that what you're talking about the potential impact of moving that harvest to another area to outside the license area? Was that what's being addressed there?
That's this is a somebody making a request. These are some of the factors, and that one is one that could affect another group. And so yes, this is part of that process that we're concerned about.
Okay. I'll probably try to come back to this issue if I have time, but I just want to go on to another document and another topic. I'd like to go to Commission's tab 36, please. This is a document dated February 7, 2001. Guidelines respecting the issuance of licenses under the Aboriginal Communal Fishing Licenses Regulations. Do you recognize this document?
I do.
Perhaps I can have this marked as an exhibit.
That will be Exhibit 1270.
Now down at the bottom of that first page, that's talking about the Sparrow decision. And the very last sentence, and this is something that came up yesterday. An additional consideration is that DFO does not have the mandate to determine whether an Aboriginal group has Aboriginal or treaty rights to fish or the nature and scope of any such rights. And we discussed that yesterday. I think your evidence yesterday, Mr. Rosenberger, was that this was something that properly falls within the federal system into the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs.
That's correct.
Does this mean, however, that DFO doesn't consider the issues of Aboriginal rights and title when it's seeking to consult with First Nations?
Could you reframe the question, please?
Well, maybe we can go to page 4 of the document, please. And here's a page that talks about the directives for licensing, and it discusses the issue of consultation with Aboriginal organizations. And one of the things that I've noticed in the documents, and is a good example here, is there's references to Department of Fisheries taking into account the historical fishing areas of First Nations.
That's correct.
Yeah. So it's kind of I would suggest perhaps an awkwardness in that, whereas DFO doesn't have a mandate to determine or seek to determine Aboriginal rights and title, it nevertheless has to be cognizant of First Nations assertions and claims of Aboriginal rights and title when it manages the fishery. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
So would you agree that consultation with respect to these asserted rights and title is an important mandate for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
Yes, I would.
Perhaps we can move to Commission tab 32, please.
Would you like to mark this up?
I think this one,
I'm sorry, we just did.
I think I did mark this one as an exhibit.
32.
This is another DFO document entitled Management Guidelines to Address FSC Sharing Arrangements for Fraser Sockeye when Total Allowable Catch does not meet FSC harvest targets. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Could I have this one marked as an exhibit, please?
That would be Exhibit 1271.
If we can just go over to the second page at the bottom. And you can see, just for the record, on the bottom of the page, it says August 12, 2009. Under proposed sharing methods, in the first sentence it says, with the exception of early Stewart sockeye, there is currently no arrangement to apportion the preseason FSC targets among individual First Nations for each run timing group. And I think that's consistent with the evidence we heard yesterday. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
In other words, although the total FSC target is split into the 4 run timing groups for planning purposes, there are no allocation agreements in place to apportion fish from a specific run timing group among individual First Nations groups. The department is proposing that any remaining FSC target assigned to the other 3 run timing groups will be combined for the purposes of apportioning among individual First Nations groups. I'm just going to stop there, and without going into this any further detail. Is this the document that kind of guides DFO managers in apportioning FSC allocations, especially when there's in low run years?
Yeah, when there's not enough sockeye to meet all of the objectives that we have laid out for First Nations food, social, and ceremonial in the IFMP, this is the guidelines that we are using.
Okay. Yesterday, Mr. Rosenberger, and I think for much of the discussion yesterday and last week, we've been talking a lot about the parties' different aspirations for co-management arrangements and processes. And I think I gleaned from your evidence yesterday your view that these processes, that are underway, if successful, will set aside integrated processes at the coastwide and perhaps sub-regional level for co-management of fish, including sockeye?
That's correct.
In your view, will those processes wholly replace engagement by DFO with First Nations at a local level?
I don't believe that they will. The department is proposing a process where it's a pyramid, for want of a better word, but there will be the bilateral or local area consultations and co-management, and so but with defined issues and responsibilities that will be clear. Then some of them defined issues and responsibilities at a sub-regional level, and then others that might be at a watershed level or larger.
And I guess the concept there would be that the engagement at the local level will be somehow ideally integrated more effectively than perhaps at present with these regional and coastwide bodies.
That's correct.
And is one of the issues, I guess, with respect to DFO currently, is it true that, especially in your areas, talk about the BC interior, is a significant portion of your time and resources, not just yours, but of your staff, spent in engaging with First Nations at different levels?
That's true.
Yeah. And one of the, I guess, perhaps benefits of this work for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in this time of perhaps finite resources, that this would allow DFO to be able to allocate its resources more efficiently with the same results.
That's one of the objectives of trying to build this process, is so that there's a best use of all the resources, those that are available to First Nations and those that are available to the department, and that we set those priorities and process to the best use we can.
Perhaps we can go to Exhibit 1220, please. I believe it's 1220. It's Canada's tab 30. And there was some discussion yesterday about commitment on both sides, First Nations and also the Government of Canada. I just want to go to page 4 of this document. Well, first of all, just to identify the document again for the record. This is the, I believe it's a DFO document discussing the overview of the Fraser River Salmon Roadmap Initiative. And on page 4, if we could go, page 3 to the bottom, sorry. And the last bullet, and we'll carry over onto the next page. As outlined in previous roadmap workshops, DFO is committed to the overarching goal of jointly, in partnership with First Nations, building a co-management process for Fraser salmon that includes a vision, objectives, roles and responsibilities, clear outcomes, as well as a clear process for building an agreement, a roadmap or action plan. Keep going down, please. And it's achieving this goal will require, and this is what I want to talk about a bit, a strong commitment from both DFO and First Nations, and dedication of resources from both DFO and First Nations. And I think, Mr. Rosenberg, this is consistent with what we heard yesterday.
Yes, I believe it is.
Now, I guess one of the interesting catch-22s about this from both sides is that, let's just talk about it from DFO's perspective. To be a commitment of, in the terms of policy commitment and resource commitment, I guess both sides will like to have some sense that there's a prospect that that money will be money well spent, and that there will be a reasonable chance of success from the commitments made. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
And I think that goes both ways. In a sense, we heard yesterday from witnesses about concerns that DFO may pull back from the efforts that First Nations are putting in. I guess it's equally the same from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that if you're going to go back and seek a mandate and a commitment and money, some of the questions you're going to be facing from your decision makers is, to what extent, in your view, are First Nations in a situation where they can respond and provide this commitment? Would you expect that that would be some of the responses you would get back?
Yes, I would.
So would you agree that one of the values of the current process, the Foreman Roadmap process, as it helps both sides in developing that, making that progress to the point where you can go back to your respective decision makers and say, we've made this much progress thus far, and I think we can take the risk of putting in the money and commitment that we need? Would you see this as one way that the Foreman Roadmap is helping this overall process?
Yes, I would.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question of Mr. Cray. One of the examples you gave yesterday was an idea about signing an MOU, and I just want to stay on this theme for a second. From the perspective of the First Nations, who would have signed this MOU if it had been put forward?
The political leadership of the communities on the Fraser.
And who specifically? What would this be? Each First Nation through its band council?
In some instances, in other instances, the First Nations have organized themselves into collectives called tribal councils, and often have confidence in those tribal councils to discuss and enter into these kinds of arrangements and sign off on a broad interest in that part of the watershed for that tribal nation.
And would it include coastal and approach groups?
Sorry, I meant to, didn't mean to exclude them.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So the idea would be that it'd be an MOU that would be signed by the political leadership of all the First Nations that are engaged in harvesting Fraser River sockeye?
That's right, or their designates, right.
Okay. And this is something that you feel that through this, with the form and roadmap process, that you'd be able to obtain that kind of a mandate to sign an MOU?
Well, it's not so much me, but...
Sorry, I should say the political leadership of, well, that's a good question. Political leadership of what organization? What forum would you use in order to get that kind of commitment from all these different groups?
Well, I think in a situation like that, the First Nations leadership would probably take a lot of heart, would have a lot of interest in such an agreement, and I'm sure that the majority of them would endorse a memorandum of understanding like that, where both parties, the First Nations themselves and the Government of Canada through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, would agree on where it is that they're going, building this co-management relationship. I think that would occur. I think that could take place.
Thank you. On this document, this is the same document as before. I'd like to go back one page. I'm going to change direction again. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of hopping from subject to subject. I want to return to a discussion that was had yesterday, and I want to focus this question on Mr. Rosenberger's. I don't think he had an opportunity to weigh in on this discussion, but if we can focus in on the use of the term dialogue. And on the third, fourth, and sixth bullets on this document. And it's interesting that the term dialogue was used in this context, and I think there was some criticism of it. The third bullet says, dialogue regarding the management of integrated commercial fisheries impacting Fraser salmon. When I read that, management of integrated commercial fisheries, that's respect to the fishery, all commercial fisheries, including Aboriginal but also non-Aboriginal fisheries?
That's correct.
And on the fourth bullet, dialogue regarding the management of recreational fisheries impacting Fraser salmon. So that's not necessarily including Aboriginal recreational fishers, but all recreational fishers.
That's correct.
And on the sixth bullet, dialogue regarding DFO policies and programs which impact on Fraser salmon. I think implicit in that is policies and programs generally that impact on Fraser salmon.
That's correct.
So when we're talking about these kind of issues, are we now into an area of what we would call Tier 3 discussions? When we're talking about dialogue in these areas?
Well, these areas will impact more than just the First Nations to DFO process. And what the department's trying to get across in this document is there are issues where we're looking to define the roles and responsibilities of a number of factors, and there's 8 or 9 of them here. And what the department is trying to make clear is that there are other interests besides First Nations interests, and we will discuss how those roles and responsibilities will be aligned, but they're not necessarily ones that bilateral relationship would be the only decision-making or the only place where there would be interactions.
And I guess that's one of the key points about the Tier 3 options and discussions we've had, is that until such time that there's a co-management Tier 3 structure where all the harvesters are in the same room, in the same body, there's going to have to be a role for DFO management in order to ultimately make those decisions as between these different harvesting groups. Would you agree?
What I'd see a role for the department now, and I see a role for the department even once the structure is in place.
Another area, just another document that we talked about yesterday, I'd like to take you to, Mr. Rosenberger, is Exhibit 290. And this is the one of the documents relating to the forum. And again, this is the last paragraph. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is something that was raised with the panel, and I don't think you had a chance to weigh in on. So I just want to ask you now. And this is the comment we had about, and again, this is a DFO document as I understand it. And the first sentence says, through this process it became clear that despite the efforts of DFO staff to support this outcome, and I should back up and say the immediate previous line, the desired outcomes in the next previous paragraph, desired outcomes include the development of a sharing plan for early Stewart sockeye. Through this process became clear that despite the efforts of DFO staff to support this outcome, First Nations collectively lacked the capacity to develop a coordinated FSC harvest sharing plan for Fraser River salmon stocks. And that talks about what was achieved at the forum. Another interesting comment I want to ask you about later on, it says, and there was a much better understanding of the complexity involved within the management of Fraser River salmon. I want to stop there. Can you just talk a little bit about what some of the issues that were discussed and have been discussed in this topic, what some of those complexities are? And also, what are some of the different interests and perspectives that you've heard being expressed at the forum?
I think the First Nations have put considerable effort and made considerable progress on understanding each other's fisheries. I think there was a fairly significant lack of understanding between some of the First Nations interior groups versus some of the coastal groups, fishing opportunities, different stocks, some of the kinds of things that Mr. Wilson, described yesterday in this process were the kinds of things that were being described in the forum process. So there's a growing understanding about what stocks, what species, harvest, availability, how people fish, how they make some of their decisions. So going through that and in some of the approaches that they've strived for and some of the options that they've worked on over time. What does that mean? And so again, yesterday, for example, Mr. Shepherd talked about the groups that generally he's from, really supporting a 3-week closure around early summer stocks. They came to a consensus that they provided a recommendation on for this year, and it was the same last year of a 1-week closure during that time frame. But there's others trying to understand, well, what's the implication because of the co-migration, overlap of timing of stock species, implications to other places. So I think there's been significant progress on that side of things, and a variety of First Nations have put out quite different views. We have some of those have been provided in letters to the department, and some of them in the discussion at the forum. Different escapement objectives to be used in a given scenario for different stock groupings between years, things like that.
I'm going to switch gears again and go to the subject of the in-river demonstration fisheries that took place, and Mr. Shepherd helpfully gave some background on that. And I just want to ask a couple of questions for you, Mr. Rosenberger, but I'd happy to have Mr. Shepherd or anybody else weighed in. On tab 6 of Canada's documents, perhaps go there first. Actually, tab 5, I'm sorry. I think there's been some questions and some discussion at earlier panels about the commercial viability of in-river demonstration fisheries, and Mr. Shepherd spoke about that yesterday. Here's a document, Mr. Rosenberg, I believe you're familiar with. Can you explain what this is?
This is an accounting from the Okanagan Nation Alliance, that's the ONA, the title, of their commercial fishery that occurred in 2010, last year. So this is a fishery that takes place about 900 miles inland, and I get my miles because it comes through the U.S. system, that's what we keep track. So
These aren't Fraser sockeye.
these are bound for the Okanagan River via the Columbia, so they migrate through the Columbia and the 9 dams.
Okay.
So the harvest that took place last year, it shows that there was a harvest of just over 1,000 fish, and it shows where some of the products, how they processed them. What it doesn't get into is where they, where and who they actually sold them to, and that side of it. But just to add that many of these fish went into restaurants and high-end markets, and they actually have an agreement for this year where a significant restaurant chain in BC will be featuring these salmon for this year's fishery. So what this was meant for is to show that the harvest, what the possibility of products are. What it doesn't show is that they've been able to make good progress on getting good value for the fish that they've harvested. And
Well, maybe we can go to the next page. I think that helps, that last part. And I just this is an example in the same document about some of the prices, I guess, for the sockeye that were,
yes, it is.
The salmon that were harvested. I'm not sure if they were. Yeah, they are sockeye.
Yes.
Can I have this marked as an exhibit, please?
That will be exhibit number 1,272.
And just on the same theme, we can go to Canada's tab 6, please. And I believe, Mr. Shepherd, is this what you were talking about yesterday? This is a document that appears to be from the Shuswap Fisheries Commission. It's an order form for these wild BC salmon products. Was this the fishery that you were discussing yesterday? Are you familiar with this document? I think, Mr. Rosenberger, you are.
I need to see the cover on this. I've seen a number of these, and I'm not sure, but we have participated collectively with the Shuswap. This could be from the report that we did jointly with the UFFCA and the Shuswap. I'm not exactly sure, but I am familiar with the fishery.
Okay, thanks. And Mr. Rosenberger, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am.
And it's an order form for persons to purchase this product, River Fresh Wild BC Salmon?
Yes, from the Swipnik people.
From the Shuswap people. And I probably should have brought this into the last panel for discussion, but under the last heading, smoked sockeye, there's some references to prices per pound, per 100 grams for in-river sockeye salmon.
Yes, there is, and for the top two are for fresh or fresh frozen fish.
Yes, that's right, sockeye is there as well. Can I have this marked as an exhibit, please?
That will be Exhibit 1,273.
One of the related issues that's come up from time to time is the process by which licenses, I guess, purchased or retired under programs like the Aboriginal, the ATP, and under PICFI are used in order to provide the access to these in-river fisheries. And I just want to go to another document in Canada's list. It's tab 20. Now this appears to be a deck for the IHPC. Are you familiar with this deck?
Yes, I am.
Mr. Rose? It's called Commercial and First Nations Inland Demonstration Fisheries, a 2010 overview. And can you just explain briefly what the purpose of this deck was for?
One of the staff of the department, Emery Wang, prepared this document to make a presentation at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee meeting this year. What we're demonstrating through the slides is how licenses have been purchased back from commercial fishermen, transferred, and there's areas, there's a Skeena, Nass examples in this deck as well as for the Fraser.
Well, maybe we'll spend a couple minutes on this document. Perhaps we can go to, and just for the record, the date on this document is 24th of March, 2011. If we can go to page 6, please. And so this slide and the next one talks about the guidelines used by DFO to transfer salmon shares from the commercial fleet into the in-river. Is that right?
That's correct.
If you go to the next slide, sorry, page 7. Yeah, that's right. And that on the third bullet, where a subset of stocks are being harvested by inland fisheries, example, Fraser, each commercial license is treated like a portfolio of stocks with different stocks. Example, Chilco versus Weaver, going to different inland groups. Sub-bullet, stocks are not convertible. Example, X percent of Chilco cannot be converted to Y percent of horsefly. Can you explain what that's about, and why that's done in this way?
The department's objective is you can't transfer from straight across from a mixed stock fishery in any given area, and all mixed stock fisheries are not the same. If you're fishing in Johnson Straits versus Juan de Fuca, or even off the mouth of the Fraser, or in the lower Fraser, so what we're striving for is to make sure we transfer the portions the same way that we're moving them out of those mixed stock fisheries and moving them into inland fisheries. So if someone was looking to fish for Chilco fish, for example, and you want to fish in the Chilcotin, then you wouldn't give them quenelle fish or horsefly fish as they're described here that would be migrating to a different part of the watershed. So it's trying to match all those different fish and stocks to the licenses we've purchased and the transfer of that total allowable catch into the various portions of the Fraser.
Okay. And maybe just quickly, just go to the highlights of this deck. Perhaps go to slide 9. And this identifies some of the First Nations demonstration fisheries in 2010 And you'll see under the third bullet, there's the River Fresh Partnership, and I think that's related to that order form we just saw just a moment ago.
That's correct.
And the other one is the UFFCA partnership, and Mr. Shepherd, that's the one that you're involved with?
Yes.
Okay. And there's a couple of others, Chehalis and Skalitz First Nation for Fraser Sockeye in the Harrison River. I won't go into further detail in this document because I think it's going to take a bit too much time. Perhaps I can just go to maybe page 18. And then 19, sorry. And this is a discussion of a hypothetical example about how this might work for the Fraser. And here, Mr. Rosenberg, you have a hypothetical example where there's a total Canadian commercial TAC of 1 million fish, and it's split out in this pie chart according to late run, early summer run, and summer run TACs.
That's correct.
And if you go over to page 20, that pie chart is separated out by the different areas. Can you just remind us again what area B, D, E, G, and H are?
These are license groupings. So license area B is Seine Fleet and southern waters of British Columbia. License area D is Gillnet Fisheries, primarily for the purposes of Fraser in Johnson Straits, but it's northern Strait of Georgia, Johnson Straits, and around partway down the west coast of Vancouver Island. Area E is the license area for gillnets in the lower Fraser River, area 29, and around the Juan de Fuca southern portion of Vancouver Island. License area G is trawlers on the west coast of Vancouver Island and around into the top of Johnson Straits. And license area E is trawlers in Georgia Strait and up into Johnson Straits.
Okay. And just to give an example of how this process works, maybe we can go to page 22. And so for each one of these areas, as I understand it, a number of licenses, and so on this one's area D, 359 licenses available, which represents 21.5% of the commercial Fraser River TAC in 2010. And it says on the right, in the small pink box, 33 licenses in 2010 were available for DFO inventory from Fraser River Sockeye inland demonstration fisheries. And I understand there's a similar slide for each one of the different areas.
That's correct.
And if you get to slide number 26, I think there wasn't any licenses for area G, so you ended up with these 4 different areas, and you added up all the different licenses from the areas, and you added together the total number of licenses from the DFO inventory that are going to be used for allocations of the in-river demonstration fishery. Is that right?
It's not a. This is an accounting of the licenses,
Yeah.
but it's if you follow the whole deck, it's a multiplication times the total allowable catch, and the equal signs at the bottom is the 12.46 is the percent of total allowable catch that can be moved into the demonstration fisheries. There are Area G licenses, for example, but Area G in 2010 did not have a total allowable catch assigned to it, so it's essentially a number times 0, so there's nothing to add into the formula.
I see. Okay, so you have 12.46% of the total allowable catch. We can go over to page 27. So going back to the hypothetical $1 million TAC in total, you have the 12.46 for the demonstration TAC, and the rest, 87.54, is the TAC for the area gear commercial fisheries.
That's correct.
And if you go over to the next slide, that 12.46 is in turn broken up into the 3 run groups, early stewards being left out. And then the last slide, slide 29, that 12.46 is again broken out by the various Natal streams and different runs. Is that what this slide is doing?
That's correct. So we use those proportions then by those stocks to allocate it back to the various demonstration fisheries around the Fraser watershed. And this one, you'll note that there's 2 or 3 of those slices of the pie that were not allocated out. So we use those opportunities to provide extra protection to some of the stocks of concern.
And I noticed that some of these, some of the smaller slices including Cultus and on the top Bowron, these are not being used for the demonstration fisheries.
Correct.
You can explain, and is that for conservation reasons?
Correct. That was the comment I just made, sorry.
Okay. I'd like to have this document marked as an exhibit.
That will be Exhibit 1,274.
My last few questions, I think, are going to be for Mr. Wilson, if I may. And I won't have the time to discuss in great detail some of the things we discussed yesterday, but I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Wilson, with respect to the HELTSIC, you talked a bit yesterday about some of the coastal and north coast, central coast and north coast organizations that the HELTSIC are involved with. Are the HELTSIC involved in any kind of formal way with aggregates or groups of First Nations that are on the island or in the south coast?
Other than IMOG?
And what is the role of IMOG and what is HELTSIC's role in IMOG?
Well, HELTSIC's role in IMOG is, it was created from our attention to the sectoral meetings. And IMOG had a meeting at the same time. I just happened to show up to a meeting and decided this was a great process to be involved in. The IMOG process is basically, it started out as a process to provide information to First Nations groups on fishery issues. All fishery issues, not just the Fraser River sockeyes.
And would it be a process ideally where, for example, if a run like 2010 ever came along again for sockeye or for Chalmers Pink, that it would be a useful process whereby DFO can get together with all coastal groups and discuss each First Nations expectations for harvest in the upcoming year in one forum where the different First Nations can share their different perspectives on their harvest? Would you agree that that would be a useful process?
I agree, but it would be a challenge because the bands outside of the Fraser, there's quite a number of bands. So I think you'd have to break them into regions as well.
I'm thinking in terms of a coastal group, like a coastal region, including South Coast as well as Central and North Coast. Perhaps using the IMOG forum.
That format possibly, yes.
I didn't want to get too much into the details of what happened with the HELTSIC fishery in 2010. I mean, some of the key players in the DFO perspective aren't here to get into that. But what I gather from this was a sense of frustration from the HELTSIC that in 2010 there was a very large year, and although a certain number of salmon were caught, there was a sense that there were more fish to be caught if the opportunity had been allowed.
Correct.
And DFO was in a situation where it was managing the fishery with respect to a number of different coastal groups and had certain guidelines and rules that it had to follow and different processes that it had to follow. And that was frustrating for the HELTSIC.
Yes.
And is this really a good case study for how perhaps a different way of approaching these issues would be to have some kind of an integrated process, a pre-season, pre-planning process, where DFO and the various groups that have allocations on the coastal areas can get together and talk about their interests in accessing these potentially large runs of salmon, and discussing how those shares can be allocated as between themselves in consultation with DFO. Isn't this a really good case study of how that would have been useful if that had been in place?
Yes, it would have been both if the stocks were in conservation or in abundance.
Okay. I think I'll just leave my questions there. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
Yes, my name is Cliff Prowse. I'm the lawyer for the province of British Columbia that doesn't really know much about First Nations issues, but I, with some supervision from Mr. Tasic, get to ask a few questions today. I'll endeavor to keep this short. Mr. Lund, could we have Exhibit 1223, please? So, one of the, in preparing to do this, I had several discouraging conversations with people as I looked for an easy answer to the issues that are confronting this panel and the commission, and the general answer I got was there are no easy answers. But then someone said, well, what we really need is something like the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. So I guess my first question is whether each of you would agree or disagree or are able to comment on whether that might be something to be strived for in our context here.
I think the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission is a good example. But it's made for Washington State tribes. It has its own history and its own way of doing business. I would suggest that it represents what is possible, that BC is languishing behind, and that whatever is created here would be made for BC. It's not going to be the same. It's not a cookie cutter issue here. So I would be encouraged to utilize certain elements of what we can learn from Washington State example. But again, it's not going to be the same for BC.
All right. Does anyone else have a comment on that?
One of the challenges with some BC First Nations are in treaty and some aren't.
Sorry, and so that would just complicate the process.
It could,
here.
yes.
And Mr. Craig?
I would agree that it's a model that can inform a future forum here in British Columbia. I agree that it's a model that could inform us, along with others elsewhere.
All right, and Mr. Rosenberger?
I think it's one of the options, models, as Mr. Gray just described, that should be reviewed and considered and look to see what elements of it might be applicable, and to the same for many other models. One was raised yesterday to look at, and I think there's a few others you could consider on options for moving forward.
So then the question is, to the extent that it is a viable option, how would we get there from here? Mr. Shepherd, do you have a view on that? How would you process towards something like the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission?
So the question is, how would we get to something like that?
Yes.
Well, I think back in 2002, I was part of a team that put together a report called Our Place at the Table, BC First Nations in the fishery. And I think one of the things that we talked about, and we're talking specific about sockeye here, so I think one of the comments, one of the recommendations that were made in there and this again probably comes from the Bolt type decision, is that 50% would be a nominal starting point, with the possibility of up to 100% for certain species in certain areas. So I think that one of the possibilities, or if we were to have just a eureka moment and we woke up one day and suddenly 50% of the sockeye fishery was transferred to First Nations and then let them figure it out, much like what happened in the Washington State example, might be one way to do that. I'm not saying it's the only way. I think that negotiations are still on the table and a good way to proceed. But I think that's what happened down there.
Mr. Rosenberger, do you have any comments on that?
Well, process-wise, from the department's, how we're seeing this moving forward is the roadmap process. So what we're trying to do is, in that process, is to get parties to look at various models and look to see what the interests are, and try to develop the vision and mandate around the parties, and see what our options are for moving forward. So for us, it's the roadmap process.
Mr. Shepherd, I noticed in your CV that you've had extensive training and, do I understand, practical involvement in mediation type processes, including in a family law type contest?
That's correct.
What are the lessons from that kind of family law context where you can get some very dysfunctional conflicts going on and different ways are used to resolve them? What are the lessons from that kind of context to this kind of context, or have you thought about that?
I think when you're talking about the work that I do, first of all, we start with an agreement to mediate, which is a good faith document. So as with any negotiation, you have to have both parties negotiating in good faith. And everything must be possible. Everything must be put on the table. It needs to be open, transparent. And, you know, the rest speaks for itself. What the outcome is not for me to judge.
One of the precepts of mediation, at least in some theories, is that all the parties need to be aware of the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which, again, in family law context, typically would include litigation. How does the litigation process impact on the way forward here?
That's a good question. I'm a peacemaker. That's what I do. It's in my nature. So I think that from my perspective, I would always look at it from the situation that I think that both parties would be better suited to sit down and have a discussion as opposed to litigate. I think that litigation is time consuming, it's costly, and all too often in First Nations country we see the rulings come down, yet we see change being very slow. In fact, we often see that the people setting the parameters are the people that we've just came out of court with. So that's why I think that sitting down to have a mediation or a negotiation, whatever you want to call it, is infinitely better and leads to more enduring outcomes.
I wanted to refer to the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum, which I think Mr. Cray has talked about in an earlier hearing. Mr. Shepherd, am I correct in thinking that you had some dealings with the ISDF and probably didn't stick with that process? Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. I was involved in the inception. Again, as I've talked about yesterday, in the Upper Fraser, we feel sometimes you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Sometimes in principle we'll tell you that this is probably not the best place to be sitting. On the other hand, decisions are being made, and if you don't show up, well, those that show up do the work. That's sort of the what we talk about in our industry. So yeah, I have been involved in it, but quickly realized from the very beginning that this was a multi-sectored approach, and really I believe, as I said yesterday, Tier 1 has to be strong. Your cornerstone is based on Tier 1, Tier 2 relationship, and so it's preemptive, or it's not preemptive, that's not the word I'm looking for, but it's too soon to get into those kinds of processes until the other two have been worked out satisfactorily by both parties.
That leads to the question of, but what's the time frame that we all have to work with to deal with what we're told is 20-year decline of Fraser River sockeye salmon, and is there a role for some kind of multi-party process as an interim, in effect, process without prejudice to the rights of the First Nations that are involved?
Can you rephrase that, please, or reframe it? I kind of see where you're going with that. So in the interim, until the relationship is strengthened and in a good working way, we still need to have sort of interim measures, or at least allow the third parties to the table. I think that's already going on. Life goes on. The fishery will continue. So yes, those things will happen. But in my viewpoint, one of the most encouraging things about this whole process is the ability perhaps to have those kinds of check-ins over the next year to kind of, I guess, have an oversight, somebody with oversight, for example, Mr. Commissioner, to follow through and make sure that these things happen. The recommendations that come out of here are extremely important. It couldn't be more timely. We are in a really, really precipitous decline, particularly in the Upper Fraser. So, in my opinion, I think you know, a 3-year to a 4-year time frame, which has already been alluded to last year, wouldn't be unrealistic and could probably achieve good results.
Mr. Cray, do you have any comments about, you talked yesterday about that on the Lower Fraser there had been some reaching out to, I'll call them Tier 3 groups, that, do you have a perspective on when that's useful and when it's not?
It's useful anytime. It's useful all the time, especially if you're on the Lower Fraser. There's an interface there of commercial, sport, and Aboriginal interests in the fishery. They share a common geographical area, a common river. They fish side by side. So it's important to have relationships with the other interests in the fishery, including, I might add, the green people, the environmentalists, who are active on the Lower Fraser River. Grand Chief Ken Malway and I think Grand Chief Ken Alloway was here earlier. We call him Walelik in the Fraser Valley. He's one of our hereditary leaders. Both he and I joined in on the discussions at the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum. And in particular, both of us were interested in the Monitoring and Compliance Committee, because both he and I know that right at the very heart of the issue in the fishery is confidence that one or the three groups may have or may not have in the numbers, the catches that are recorded and reported. We feel that right at the heart of the issue is catch and the reliability of catch information. So we both zeroed in on the Compliance and Catch Monitoring Committee and the work that it's doing. And we like to think we've done a lot of good work with other committee members, and it's not just Aboriginal people, it's sport fishery interests, commercial fishing interests, and we're not talking about novices, we're talking about senior commercial fishermen. Been in the business for years, and very capable people they are, as well as sport fishing interests with a long history in the sport fishery and being advocates for their interests, and of course on our side of the table, Aboriginal people. And there were conservation groups in the room as well. And so we paid a lot of attention, devoted a lot of time to the meetings of that committee. And we've worked out projects on the Lower Fraser together, such as giving the committee an opportunity to tour our chum fisheries to see how closely they're managed and how the accounting of the catch is done. And we have plans this summer for a project in the sockeye fishery in monitoring that should provide valuable lessons for all of us. And we plan on continuing to do work with that committee on into the future, as long as it has as long as it's a working committee and has a mandate to continue onward.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, yesterday your council put in the Central Coast First Nations Marine Use Plan Executive Summary, which was Exhibit 1269, and that has some reference in it to what I'll call Tier 3 involvement with multi-sectoral. How do you see the, first of all, do you have any knowledge of the ISDF, the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum? Were you part of that at all?
No.
How do you see the role of Tier 3 processes as we deal with the ongoing annual and decadal declines in the Fraser River sockeye salmon fortunes?
Well, I can speak for the Central Coast Harmonized Marine Use Plan, which would set up a technical group that would address how we go about meeting with the other user groups. Well, I'll rephrase that. The user groups, we're not considered user groups.
Yes.
So that technical committee would represent the Central Coast. But it's a little bit of a challenge in the Central on sport fishing, specifically, because the majority of the sport fishers are lodge driven, so they have clients flying in, and I believe a lot of those clients are not from BC, so they clearly don't understand the issues of First Nations entitlement rights and access, of course. So it would be a challenge, but the technical committee would be burdened with that task.
Working through these problems.
Yes.
Mr. Commissioner, those are my questions.
Thank you very much.
But this might be time for a brief morning adjournment, Mr. Commissioner.
The hearing will recess for 10 minutes.